I'm Barika Williams. I'm the Deputy Director at ANHD, the Association for Neighborhood and Housing Development. So we are a nonprofit here in New York City that works on creating, preserving, and protecting affordable housing and economic opportunity across all 5 boroughs. And we work with about over 100 neighborhood groups across the city who are both affordable housing developers and managers, and have a portfolio in excess of about 125,000 affordable housing units. So if it's okay with the board, I rushed here. I was actually originally going to be off today, but I believe this board and what you all do is critical and very important. So I'd like to, if it's okay, submit my written testimony later. So if I can do that and submit you all written testimony later on this week, just because I want to sort of dig through the numbers a little bit more and formalize my written version, if that's okay.
That's fine.
Okay, thank you. I'll still. No, it's okay. Let's see. All right. Okay. So I think one of the things that I really want to highlight in my testimony is that ANHD and the member groups that we work with and represent are affordable housing developers and managers. So I want to emphasize the fact that this is also bringing into the conversation how nonprofit and local neighborhood developers are thinking about this, and how they manage the challenges of running a building, sustaining its fiscal security and responsibility, and also being responsible to their tenants. So as operators of low and moderate rent level housing, our members find ways to make repairs, maintenance, and building upkeep while also ensuring the finances without rent burdening their tenants. So I want to emphasize that all of the programs that I'm going to talk about are available to all rent-regulated building owners by different sizes, as I'll sort of go through. But these are both for-profit and for nonprofit building managers. There are resources for smaller buildings with less than 20 units, as well as resources for larger buildings with more than 20 units. This includes some of HPD's programs, the Article 8A loan program, which provides rehabilitation loans for upgrading and replacing major building systems, with an emphasis on energy, which I know is going to be critical given that in the PIOC one of the big expenses was fuel. The Participation Loan Program, PLP, which provides city capital or federal home funds, combined with bank financing for participating private lenders for 1% or moderate substantial rehabilitation of building systems. So this is kind of thinking about full building repair work, new boilers, things like that, right? Structural improvements, roofs, modernization of apartment interiors and corridors. Similarly, for small buildings, there are also resources for moderate to gut rehab of small buildings. So this is also sort of getting and touching into not just small repairs, but also sometimes more substantial work that needs to happen on small buildings, which we know is often difficult to finance. There's not always as many resources for smaller buildings. So the Small Owner Repair Program, SORP, provides a 10-year forgivable loan for limited systems replacement and other key repairs for 3 to 20 unit buildings, as well as the J51 program, which is a 34-year or 14-year exemption from the increase in real estate taxes for rehabilitation work and tax exemption work, which I know also was one of the things flagged in PIOC was the change in taxes for some of these buildings.
Now, can you tell me your portfolio, so to speak, what percentage of the buildings pay real estate taxes?
So I think it actually depends, and it varies based on where the building is. And it's actually something that nonprofits as well as for-profits struggle with similarly, right? When you start the building, and many of these buildings are financed and underwritten with low or no taxes as subsidized buildings, then we hit about year 15 on most of the stock, and it starts to age out of some of these programs. Year 15 to year 30, they need to be restructured and refinanced. It's something that they struggle with as building managers trying to be fiscally responsible. But oftentimes it's sort of renewing and re-upping tax exemption programs with the city or the state. Oftentimes that includes extending the affordability term, but the J51 program is available for both for-profit and nonprofits.
In terms of real estate property, New York City real estate property tax, do most of your members have an exemption from them because they're tax-exempt organizations?
It's less so about them being tax-exempt organizations. It's more so about the affordability levels, terms, and regulations in the building. So it's more about whether or not when the building was first structured or created or built, originally, let's say if we're starting with new construction affordable housing units, whether or not they were created, built with a subsidized program that had something like a 420C that has basically relatively no taxes in the beginning, or an Article 11, things like that. But there are also many people who acquire or already existing portfolios that have low-income units, that have stabilized units, and they're looking to modernize, rehabilitate those units the same as anybody would who goes out and purchases them now. So then they have the similar challenge of communicating with the city, communicating with the state, and potentially putting together a tax package on that in order to drive down the tax costs.
Thank you.
No problem. So I mean, I think the J51 program specifically reduces taxes by about 8%, a little bit more than 8% or 12%, depending on the certified reasonable cost. So I think that's something, and we'd be happy to send the board more information on what that is and who it's available to, if that's a specific area that you all want to focus on. So I think another thing to sort of highlight in this, and one of the things that I noticed in the research and the reports, is that I know that the PIAC had a 6-point-something% increase, but I also want to point out that the NOI also had a significant increase, right? So this is, I think, one of the things that we always sort of question and think about and struggle with, is that the RGB's role and the thinking about what rents do is not about guaranteeing profits. It's about making sure that there's enough fiscal responsibility to cover and manage a building, but not guaranteeing a certain level of return for building owners. So the NOI has increased 36.4% in the past 5 years. So that's a substantial increase in just 5 years in terms of the operating income that buildings are regularly seeing and getting. And I think it's important to emphasize that in the past 2 years, this board has issued a rent freeze, and during both of those years, there has still been an NOI increase. In 2014, it was a 3.5 increase, and in 2015, it was a 10.8 increase, right? So I think that highlights that even in a rent increase, there's still ways that landlords are increasing rents to cover their costs, and likely doing so in excess of what it costs, and they are actually doing it in excess of what it costs to operate the building, right? So there is income coming in and covering the expenses of what it takes to manage and run a building. So this, I think, really highlights our point of the suggestion that changes in owners' operating costs should be matched by increased rents to tenants isn't true, right? That it's not that every time an owner has a new cost, tenants have to have a new cost. The whole point of reserves and fluctuation is that you're trying to manage risk over a period of time, and sometimes you're going to have an uptick in cost, and sometimes you're going to have a downtick in cost, and that you want the rents to sort of flow through that and hold steady, right? Rent-stabilized buildings remain constant during periods of market decline, and rather than tracking up or down with the broader rental market, yet tenants have not declined when those costs have declined, right? And I think this is a real critical point, is that when there are drops in costs in terms of operating a building, when we have a year where fuel costs go down and it's somewhat cheaper, it's not as if those renters see a drop in their rent, and that's where you're starting to have a landlord have the ability to put some money away for a reserve to then potentially pay for these things. And when they have a bigger major cost that can't be covered with this is when we think they should be taking advantage of these programs. That's what they're there for, as opposed to passing on that entire expense to tenants. So I think the other thing that I would highlight is that I know the numbers seem to suggest that income overall is ticking up, and that income in these buildings specifically is increasing. But I would point out that there's the largest disparity between the income of rent-stabilized tenants versus the income of market rate tenants in a building, and there's also a discrepancy between the income of pre-1947 rent-stabilized tenants and post-1947 rent-stabilized tenants. And some of this is the struggle of the data. We end up with, in a rent-stabilized building that has, like a 421A building, all of those units are deemed rent-stabilized, and so end up with the data. And so you have somebody who is in a rent-stabilized building, in a rent-stabilized unit, who could be showing up in the data with a $5,000 rent, right? They are in here just as well. So the discrepancy in 2014 was about $18,000 between a rent-stabilized versus a non-regulated unit, and that's not even accounting for the difference in years of when the stock was built. So let's see. I think in general, I want to give you all a chance to ask questions and to sort of dig into some other additional things as you have thoughts. But I think it's imperative that we believe that to protect the city's affordable housing stock, and as low and moderate income tenants continue to struggle in terms of income, and their income continues to be stagnant here in the city, that we find a way to make sure that we're continuing to manage our buildings as a city in a fiscally responsible way, but not placing the burden of all of those costs onto tenants for them to bear, and for them to bear the need for an increase in profit as opposed to covering and ensuring safe and sound housing.
Thank you. Questions?
Do you have any specific recommendation for an action that we should take this year?
I know that there are, I think that there are a couple of options that we would feel more comfortable with. I believe we are fully in support of a rent freeze, and I think I think we'd have some questions and want to understand how the city is going to support both nonprofit and for-profit owners with some of the concerns about taxes and energy in a rent rollback, but are also very comfortable with that.
So just to clarify, your member organizations that are nonprofits that own and operate affordable housing are in favor of a rent freeze?
Yes.
Okay. And then a unrelated but follow-up question. When you said that, the data that show that despite the rent freeze, rents are rising, I'm assuming that that's through, that, like the rest of us, you understand that's through MCIs and IAIs?
Yes. Yes.
So what are the affordable housing providers doing in that regard? To the extent that they're probably not doing MCIs and IAIs.
I think, I would actually say, I think from what we've seen, much of the rents continuing to rise despite a rent freeze are MCIs, IAIs, vacancies, and also preferential rents. It's all four of those. It's a combination of all of those. I think for our developers and building managers, they are really looking at increasing the rents in order to cover the actual costs, not necessarily the calculation that is given and provided by HCR, and that those two things don't necessarily align. And then more importantly, whenever possible, using these programs so that they don't need to tap into those types of in rent increases in order and pass them on to the tenant. So rather than use HCR's calculation to say we're going to pass on, a $200 increase because we replaced the roof, talking to the city to then help finance the roof through a city program and allow the rents to stay at their current level or just the RGB increase.
So how do your owners cover basic rising costs?
So, I think it's not, I would say, it's not that our owners are never increasing their rents, right? And I think for us, it's very important that everybody in the city be good building managers, right? We also can't just say, you started with a $700 rent and we're never going to change it, and it's 30 years later and everybody will be fine. Now, we know that that is the financial reality for a lot of people, and so I think there is a sort of a larger conversation as a city of what happens when somebody's income has never changed from that point, which I think is where things like SCREE and DREE and some of the other, there's been a long call for a SCREE and DREE type of program for people who are on fixed income, who may not be seniors and who might not be disabled as well. But I think, so it's not as if they're not taking a rent increase. I think the conversation that our building managers really have is, what is the rent increase that we need to take in order to actually cover the long arc cost of the building, as opposed to the maximum allowable increase that we are allowed to take as designated both by this board and by the state.
So, I guess the question goes to, let's say there was a building in the ANHD member portfolio that was underwater. What would a building owner do if the building wasn't making, how would it be able to function if there was a rent freeze and it felt like it needed to do one-year leases, increases, and there was a zero and they couldn't get those increases? What would the owner do?
I mean, I think there's some questions about why the building is underwater, right? And is the building underwater because, I mean, this is not our members, hopefully, but is the building underwater because somebody purchased the building expecting very different rent prices than what the building's rent rolls will currently allow? Is the building underwater because of a major capital issue that maybe somebody didn't anticipate? That, we do have, we are, building managers like everybody. There are unforeseen conditions, so a lot of people went through some of this stuff around Sandy, and not just folks in Sandy, but impacted by Sandy, but in broader areas, really thinking about what it means to have reserves differently than they previously did, and having enough money to redo a boiler, potentially relocate a boiler, right? Rethink about the energy systems in a building. So I think for our building owners, at that point in time, it starts to be looking at what's in that building's finances. Is there something in their broader portfolio of buildings? Because they don't all own multiple buildings, but some of them own more than one. And so is there ability to have one building that doesn't have that, potentially move a little bit of cash over in a way where you're not compromising that building, that original building's finances, and cover something that then you can flow back, or also engage the city with some different city programs. And I think that's no different than larger for-profit building managers who have bigger, many of whom, not all of whom, have bigger portfolios than some of our groups.
How are your owners able to raise rents if above the guidelines? For example, if the guideline is 0? Do you offer preferential rents? Do your owners offer preferential rents?
I mean, I would say they probably do, and they are allowed to, so.
Yes, understood.
I think their evaluation of when to go from a preferential rent higher than what it started with, I think is oftentimes somewhat different than what we feel like we see for other building managers in the city, right? Also, many of our groups are not all of our groups, but many of our groups are not just building managers or owners, right? They're also running programs or connected to other groups that run community programs, and so they know that, Miss Jones just went through some sort of difficulty, or somebody's mom just got sick, which is why they're having this challenge, or this person just enrolled in X, Y, and Z program and are really committed to sort of helping themselves and change their circumstance. So I think jumping from a preferential to a legal rent when you know the person, you know what they're trying to do, and you know their circumstances is very different, which I think is why many of our groups really evaluate what that is, very different than other managers in the city.
So I just also, like when you mentioned an HPD program, so if they do go into an HPD program and they are underwater, is there a rent restructuring that happens? Like, what are the systems that HPD allows to, if a nonprofit, because of, let's say, regular rent freezes felt like they couldn't keep up their rent roll, what would be their option?
So, I mean, there is rent restructuring, there's potentially low or no interest loans that you can take out and pay back over time. There are, I mean, in sort of more extreme circumstances, you can potentially transfer over that building's portfolio to somebody else who feels more comfortable taking it on, right? Which I know no building manager necessarily likes to do that, but sometimes it's the size or the scale or the of a building that, based on an individual building manager's capacity, just sometimes makes it difficult. I think generally our members have found that I think one of the things that we have found with working with our building managers is that HPD is very open to that conversation, right? They don't know, it's bad for DOB, it's bad for HPD, it's bad for the tenants, it's bad for the city when buildings get to the point where they are underwater and then start to fall into disrepair. And I think the broader conversation that everybody's been having is, let's start to have this conversation earlier, as opposed to when the building gets to a critical point and is sort of in desperation. The sooner that we start to have those conversations, the easier. And so ANHD has worked with our members around training to say, where are you? How are you evaluating your finances? Like, what are your 5-year projections? Do you need to think about restructuring your current cash flow of your building slightly? Are you spending too much on A or B? And then have those conversations and help expand the capacity and the training of both of our building managers, but also encourage them to have those conversations sooner when there are alarm bells, right?
Thank you. Any further questions? No, thank you very much for your testimony. We'll look forward to receiving your written testimony.
Thank you all. Thank you for having me.
Is Bobby Sackman here? She's not? She's not here, okay. Yeah. So would this be a good opportunity to go over the proposed order so everybody feels comfortable with what we're doing on April 25th? Where is this, who's this from? Ah, okay. Okay. All right, so Andrew's going to lead this discussion.
So I guess maybe we should start with the apartment order.
Yes.
So we have proposed language that it's a boilerplate, that it's basically what is on the current order that's out there. So we can go through it and see what we're voting on. Clearly, the first part of the apartment order is the 1- and 2-year lease renewals for apartments that we have to do. That's one of our mandates, obviously. The proposed vacancy allowance for...
Before we get to that, so what's happening on April 25th is that we'll have a series of proposals for a range for proposed increases for 1- and 2-year leases. And my understanding is that this year, the way this works is that anybody can make a proposal. By tradition, we alternate between the owners and the tenants going first in terms of making a proposal. And then any public member is free to make a proposal. But basically, after proposal is made, we have an opportunity for discussion. And then there's a vote on that proposal, in this instance, for a range, as opposed to a final number. So what...
Can I just jump in there? You don't have to propose a range.
Okay.
I mean, if you want to do a fixed number, that's fine. I mean, you could do it either way, so I just wanted to...
Okay. The theory of doing a
Thought there should be a
range is that
reality
we
to
still have, I think, opportunities for additional information coming from additional public testimony that may be submitted, and so we want to give ourselves the flexibility to respond to additional public testimony. That's the theory of the range, as opposed to just putting out a straight number. But Andrew's absolutely correct. Legally, we don't have to do a range.
And also, just so we're clear, that in the past, there can be differentials for different types of units, like in the past.
Yes.
With a casata, as long as it's in the preliminary vote, if someone wanted to say something, let's say buildings, from my bias perspective, that had less than, 70% stabilized units, it would be this, versus more than 70% stabilized units, it could be that. Or from our owner's perspective, it could say rents under this amount should get this, at least this of a supplement, basically, and that's the history coming out of the Casada decision.
I think that's correct, but the one thing to bear in mind that even with Casada, you cannot do it income-based. You cannot have a guideline that says tenants paying less than, or earning less than $30,000 a year get a certain percentage, and those earning more get another percentage. It cannot be income-based. That's the key. That's in the law. The other ones, because of Casada, are sort of up for grabs, I think, so that.
Right, they're up for grabs, and in that sense, if you're contemplating doing a proposal that is creative in that respect, if we get a little bit of a heads up, we can run it by the law department just to make sure that there would not be enforceability problems. Okay, so that's the
So that's the main.
proposed adjustment.
Yeah, proposed adjustments, and and to that, owners go first this year. I looked at the transcript, so you'll be proposing first at the meeting, and tenants, if we do the traditional thing, as Kathy said. So the board has done some other things recently. The vacancy allowance has been in the order for a very long time. It's not something the board has to do, but it's in the proposed language because it's been there, and it's not exactly how it's written, because if you felt you're doing a proposal that doesn't want a vacancy allowance, we can make that clear, and it would be 0%, and if that passed, that language should just not be there at all, but it's in the template because it has been there. It's something for the board to address. Similarly,
Well, yeah, just to make clear, we don't control vacancy allowances. The only thing we would be doing was making a recommendation that would be something different than the state mandate.
yeah, I should say that. The state obviously does it. There's nothing in the law saying that we can't add to that vacancy allowance. So that's why we make it clear that we're not doing it in the order. That's a very good point. It's already there. The board used to only before 97 would set a vacancy allowance if they saw fit, because it was. There has been no board since 97 that is tacked onto that vacancy allowance.
Yeah.
But if you feel like you would like to propose something like that, it's not suggesting that you can't to do that.
But we can't change.
We cannot we
State
can't
law.
eliminate the 20% vacancy allowance, so. I don't believe so, because you would be going against what state law is doing. So I mean, we could double check with that, but my understanding is that then you're going against what state law is doing and legislation and going beyond the.
By negative, you mean if there's a vacancy, there would have to be a rollback?
That there would be a negative percentage of funds taken off.
Yeah, I don't
I see.
believe that could be done. I mean, I could run it by the law department, but I don't, because then you're changing, legislation at the state level by doing that.
So,
I wouldn't mind if you would ask, just to ensure that we.
Sure, we can ask.
what we're saying, though, is if we did 0 for a vacancy, it wouldn't really matter, because state law is state law. So as long as we don't do anything above what state law,
Right.
is what you're saying.
Right.
But I think, Helen's point is, if we did something that was 0 or negative, would that have any implications for the state law? Because 0, if we did nothing, or we said nothing, it would mean nothing, as long as we don't say anything more than state law.
Yeah, I think the point was to make it clear, we're not adding anything to what's on the state law, and I think it's a good practice to leave it in there to make that clear that, it is what it is in the state law. This board is not touching that. If that's the decision of the board members going forward, that's what they want to do. But that's the purpose of that language. But we can, can certainly ask.
So apparently there is an option to not have any language about this at all.
Or I guess we could, just to be clear, we could say that the board shall have no additional vacancy allowance above which is...
That is exactly what we do. If you look at the current order, it says there's no vacancy allowance other than, ordered by this board, except what's in, and they cite the legislation. But it doesn't need to be there at all. We could, so if you do an order, you propose that, you don't have to include any of that language. That's not necessary. Similar to the sublet allowance. The board has been doing that for several years, so it's in the template, but if it's, if you propose something with a 0% sublet allowance, that would just disappear, and that passes at the final vote, language would disappear.
Just to be clear, anything we propose in the preliminary vote has to be exact language for the final vote, if the proposal, right?
It's what's in the proposal would be the exact language.
As the final vote.
As the final vote, yes.
So you can do a combination of a negative and a 0 if it wasn't in the proposed initially.
Correct.
I mean, for the vacancy and other things that we're talking about, or taking something away.
Once we vote on what is the proposal, then we can't switch it unless it's consistent with
No, if
the proposal.
a
Maybe I don't
proposal...
understand your question, I'm sorry.
Yeah, I think if a proposal, whatever the preliminary guideline is, and it's a 0% sublet allowance, that can change in the final proposal as long as it's one of the board members' proposal that they made public. Yeah, that's why you have a preliminary. We would doing a final if we, so you could change that if you want to change that. That's fine.
I'm sorry, I don't understand.
So if we passed a preliminary that had a sublet allowance of 10%, which is what, and the sublet allowance for folks that are new, is that an owner can add can add 10% onto the rent when a tenant sublets the apartment. And as the state law goes now, is that the tenant in place can add 10% if the apartment is furnished. So as much as the rent can increase as much as 20% on someone who's subletting a rent-stabilized apartment. And that was the idea of the sublet allowance. You can revisit that or not revisit that, but, so if in the preliminary guideline it is passed that there's a 10% sublet allowance, and someone puts forth a proposal at the final, and it says, I want a 0% sublet allowance, and that passes, that's fine. It does not have to be in the preliminary for that to be the case. You can switch that number out.
So we're not limited to the range that we...
Well, unless, there it's a fixed number, unless there's a range voted there.
So we're not limited to, so that's a different rule that applies to rent increases. So the rule with rent increases is we have to choose something within the range in the preliminary. This one, we could reject the sublease.
I don't think it's that either, because let's say I propose a range that's voted down. Never happened before, but maybe it would one day. But that isn't in the final preliminary vote. We can still vote within a range that's in my proposal, even though it was voted down, as long as we proposed it and voted on it.
Is that true for the rent increases too?
Yes.
So we could choose anything in the final order that any of us have proposed.
And vote, and the preliminary vote, exactly.
Voted on it, even if it's been rejected.
Yes.
And does that have to be in the preliminary vote, or it could be closer to the final?
I think it has to be in the preliminary vote because you have this period of public comment.
Which I know is shorter than the time, am I wrong? I thought it was only 72 hours.
Oh, I think we're talking about two different things.
Oh.
The public comment period is, after the preliminary vote, we have to wait 30 days before we can have hearings. That's the public comment period, and then we have public comment, which is kind of weird. So we hear public comment. But at the final vote, we have to put 72 hours before anything the board is going to consider has to be made public. And that's done, you have to put it on the agency's website, and also has to be circulated to the board 72 hours before the vote is going to be
Before
taken.
the final vote.
Final vote, yep. So you're not going to have an range there, right? You're just going to have, at that point, you're going to have what you... Specific, right, right. So, the board contains a range. It's never fallen out of the range at a final vote. Are there circumstances that the board could then not be within that range, I guess, is the question. But the idea of the range is for public comment, staying within that range, it makes, the public comment relevant because if you did a range
Focuses the public
of 0 and 3% or -2 to 1% or whatever it is, and the final guideline's 5% for 1 year, then what's that mean to the public comment? So you have to bear that in mind when you're proposing a range, that, you feel strongly that somewhere, at least you are going to be somewhere in that range.
I'm still a little confused about the sublet and what we do there. Is there an amount that's already set by state law, the way there
Not for
is
the
for
owner.
vacancy allowance?
No, not for the owner.
I see.
There's
So
a 10% allowed to tenants if the apartment is furnished. This is coming back from a place that, you no longer have to do a sublet allowance. It's not something the board has to do. But if you feel as though the owners incur costs to sublet an apartment, then allowing a 10%, as though the tenant is getting the 10%, I think that's where the rationale that came from, and that's why the board has done that. But maybe it's something that whoever, within your proposal, you no longer want to do that. Certainly, tenant proposals in the past have not included a sublet allowance, which is fine.
What has past experience been for adopted sublet allowances? What has been the highest?
It's always been 10%. It's never been lower or higher. It's just
It's
been,
never
it's
been 0%.
matched what the tenant is getting.
And it's never 0%. It's always,
I don't
historically,
think there's been a
10%.
year that it was 0. Since it started back, and I say it was probably 97 was the first order. Before that, there was no sublet allowance. So when it was first done, I want to say it was 97, 98, something like that, it's been 10%. And it's been, I believe, in every order. I don't think there's been an order since then that it hasn't been. Prior to that, it wasn't a part of any order. So just to make it clear, it's not something this board has to set, whereas we have to set renewal lease adjustments for 1- and 2-year leases, and then we have to do the special guidelines, which we'll get to. And, so that...
So if we did nothing, then there would be no...
There would be no language.
Owners increase or on a sublet.
But
Right.
it's essentially, if I'm understanding it right, so if the rent is $100, I'm getting my 10%, so I'm charging $110. When the rent goes up to $101, I'm not getting an additional 10%, I'm just maintaining my 10% of the whole rent, right? I'm going up to $1
No, you get a 10%
increase.
And then,
So-
right, so the owner,
For the
so if it's
tenant.
$100 and the owner and a sublet can do it to $110 a month, not for,
Right. No, but say that's what I'm getting now. And then the new guideline didn't include that 10, right? So the legal rent would go up to whatever, $102, but
oh, I see what you're saying.
then I would lose that $8, right? I mean, we're kind of maintaining, we're not adding a new 10% every time, if I understand.
But we are,
Correctly, and
because
it's not, it doesn't become part of the base rent either, right, for the
It's just a
tenant in
surcharge,
place.
It's maintaining the
But it does-
existing surcharge and putting it on top of the new rent versus adding a new 10% each time.
But keep in mind that tenants can't sublet their apartments
Yeah.
for extended periods of time. So so if you, let's say you go away for a year because you have a job, then you leave New York and you sublet your apartment for a year, it's whatever the guidelines are for that year. So the next year, when you're up to renew your lease, if you're coming back, then you would either, if you're subletting it for a second year or not, like the rent's going to be what the rent is. So the question really is, I think, is whether owners should get a 10% differential.
Right.
And just to be clear that we've proposed every year having that as be 0, even though that hasn't passed this board, that's been in our proposals every year.
Right, and it would be the length,
It's the differential on the legal rent, it's not a new 10% every time, that's the only.
correct,
Right.
right. And yes, exactly. And also, it would be if it was a 2-year lease that the prime tenant had signed and that tenant was in that 2-year period, and we said the first year is done, and then we say no 10%, they're still under that 10% until that lease is up. It's like any guideline period. And then the next, by then, technically, they should be out, so it wouldn't affect. But you wouldn't change a tenant that's subletting under a 2-year lease renewal. That would still, the terms would still be under there, because that's the guideline they signed the lease under.
Because how often can a tenant sublease, like, let's say,
It's,
sublease?
right, it's two years for every 4 years, yeah, 2 for every 4. And I've always been unclear, but is it, if you're in an apartment 8 years, can you do 4 consecutive years? Or do they have, it's all within a 4-year period? Okay, 2 years in a 4-year period.
So it's 50% of the time. Basically, rolling 4-year period.
And
But
there's
you gotta
al-
come back.
There's limitations, like you can't, let's say, I want to move to Washington Heights and I live in the Lower East Side. That's not you have to have a valid basis to be able to sublet. You have to get owner's approval, and they can't,
Right, owner has
refuse,
to
unreasonably refuse, or there's all these factors that you have to look at, like, I got this thing in California because my mom's sick. You have to, there's a,
enforcement mechanism if the person has 2 rent-stabilized apartments.
well, there are, because you bring holdover proceedings against someone for having multiple rent-stabilized apartments. It's what owners do all the time.
They don't allow.
But sometimes the landlord doesn't realize.
Right. And this assumes the owner.
It's just like overcharging and other things that we experience when it's the residents.
All right, can we move forward?
Yes, next.
All right, so, the next part is we have to do loft guidelines, which again, for 1 and 2 year leases. So that's something we have to do. And again, the vacancy loft unit proposal, we are simply saying, in the past, we simply said no vacancy allowance, and then we cite, I wish I had the actual order, but there's language we use there, template
Other
that's
than
saying if
permitted
there
by
is-
state law.
Right, we've never done a vacancy allowance for loss.
Does the loft proposed increases historically tend to track the apartment
In
ones?
recent years, they have. And some years, they've been divergent because of, there may be differences between expenses in loft buildings versus apartment buildings, so there may have been some adjustment there. But probably in the last 15 years or so, they've mirrored the renewal, and it's it's hard to get to the total number of units that we impact. It's not many at all, so it's something we have to do, but the impact on the overall housing stock is not very,
Negligible.
is negligible, thank you. The fractional terms, okay, goes back to a time when if a tenant had signed a vacancy lease initially and it was a fractional term and it wasn't specifically said a 1 or a 2 year period, it sort of explains how the guidelines would be adjusted for them, so that fractional language is in there, and I've taken that from our intro. All these are, different things are explained in the intro, but there's a discussion about the fractional. It's on page 95, and why it's in there. But that's to cover if somebody is signing something other than exactly a 1 year or a 2 year lease. So anything under 1 year, that's the 1 year guideline. Anything over the 1 year to 2, I believe, is what it says, would be considered, let's see. Yeah, so the board orders provide that lease terms up to 1 year shall be deemed a 1 year lease for the purposes of determining the appropriate rent adjustment. Similarly, a lease term of more than 1 year and up to 2 years in length is deemed a 2 year lease. We have no idea how many are operating under this, but it's still out there. At least we're covering our tookuses. So that's the point of the fractional language. Escalator clauses, that's also explained in here, I believe, under the next paragraph under the fractional terms. So on 95 again, escalator clauses are provisions in lease agreements permitting periodic rent adjustments that are generally fixed or pegged to some economic indicator. Most escalators clauses are no longer permitted in stabilized leases. But if there are some still out there operating that way, we want to make it clear what's considered, what happens in that
Like
case.
trumps the...
And you can look at the language exactly from the escalator. So that's template languages along with the fractional, the template. That's always been in our orders as long as they can remember. And then we have to do special adjustments under prior orders. I think that's self-explanatory. So if we had some special adjustment under a previous order, they're still in as part of the base rent, and our increases are above that, is essentially what that's saying, and that's generally boilerplate, except the date changes. And proposed special guideline, and that's when we are determining, there's sort of two sets of units that the most commonly, and that's addressed under when we're dealing with rent control. I think that's the next decontrol units proposal and the proposed special guideline. They're both considered rent control units, but under the proposed special guideline, they're rent controlled for a different reason other than the law existing prior to rent stabilization. So the point of that is to cover those rent control units if they are still indeed out there. So it's a little slightly different legislation than what the original rent control law was in the 40s. So we want to make sure that we're covering that group of rent control as well. And so that historically has been the same from 1 to 1. That special guideline and the decontrolled would, currently it's, I believe, 33% above the maximum base rent. The reason we did the 33%, it's the difference between the median rent in the HVS for rent control versus the median rent for stabilized. So that's the rationale behind that. If you feel there's another reason we should not have that or whatever, it's fine, but that's why it's at 33%. So that we also have to do. We do need to do that. The HCR is also allowed, owners, I should say, are also allowed to take comparable rents in a building to set those new stabilized rents. They're also allowed to deregulate from rent control. They can go right into deregulation. So the impact of this guideline on rent control, there's 30,000 rent control units in the city, according to the HVS, roughly. How many become vacant in a particular year? About 800 or so. So that's who we may be impacting, but again, there's a couple other mechanisms they can use. So this is not impacting. It's just hundreds of units that we're impacting with this special guideline. But again, it's something by law that we have to do.
Your point is really the important point. Is they're looking for comparables in the building. So if a rent control unit is, $2,000 and the comparables in the building are $4,000, then they're already going to go to $4,000. That doesn't include doing the IAIs, and so there's a lot of mechanism. This doesn't preserve any of these rent stabilized units as affordable. All it does is give the owner another way to get a rent control unit up to a higher rent level beyond what already exists under statute.
And that was, the concept behind it initially was to bring rent control units, which they felt were under market, whether you want to change that opinion or not. But that was the whole idea of the special guideline, was to bring them up to at least, what the stabilized units, or closer to market, I guess. See that behind it.
So we have to vote on something, but,
Yeah, I mean, you could say that you have to put it, if for some reason you wanted to do zero, it's the decontrol units proposal and the permission to increase, we have to have a zero there if that's what you want to do.
So just for clarification, it sounds like historically the only things that there has been alternatives or controversy about have been the proposed adjustment for renewal leases. Everything else seems to have been by consensus by the board. Other than that, is that correct?
No, the tenants have had different proposals.
history you're.
Okay. So I guess I'm trying to figure out what's.
Been the same.
Yeah, but I'm trying to figure out what are we going to be talking about other than
Probably, historically, preliminary guideline, you're really concentrating on the 1 and 2 year renewal.
And do we expect that to be the case this year, I guess, is the question.
I mean, it would be part of your proposal, and you can argue whether there should be a sublet allowance or not be a sublet allowance, but when you make a proposal, if you want to say the reason, and I encourage you to do this, if you want to say the reason why you're not including something or whatever, you can certainly do that. Board members can just do a proposal if they want. They can decide that, I want to explain my proposal, that's fine as well. There can be certainly comments to somebody's proposal. Kathy will, once the proposal is made, she'll open the floor for comments, and there can be a discussion about that proposal. And once it goes to vote, then it goes to vote, and then if it's passed, that's it. If it's not passed, then we go on from there and consider other proposals.
But just for David's benefit, you can expect, I think, that the tenants are going to make a proposal for the sublet, and also with respect to the special guideline and the decontrolled, that is different than what has been passed in historically.
And bear in mind the importance of what you're, if, to Helen's point, if you wanted to do a vacancy allowance with 10%, that's going to be lawsuit written on either side, probably owner's side, that you can't do that, but anything to negate a guideline that's been passed, they're going to turn to. So bear in mind that you do want to try to stay within what we think we legally can do, and, it's fun to get sued every 4 or 5 years, but we always have to be able.
4 years old.
Hey, wait a minute. Hold on, we just got sued. Yeah, I need 2 or 3 years off. But no, but I'm just saying that, understand that when you do a proposal, that there can be ramifications, and whether it's worth it, I guess is what.
Further discussion, or is it time for lunch?
Can I ask you a question? Because
Lunch is here.
You mentioned about nonprofits, you raised the issue of nonprofits feeling like the guidelines, the 0 and the 2 over the last 2 years, because that's different, we've heard really different information about nonprofits being in that shape. So is it something through testimony? I don't know where you got that information from.
I'm relying primarily on conversations and some information that was presented by CPC. They're going to come back and talk about it. I mean, they do affordable housing development, and then just general conversations that I've had with, people in the owner community.
Okay. Because that's why we specifically had ANHD come here, because they're in 100
But I think
members.
what struck me about that testimony is that, A, they may not be subject to real estate taxes, and B, they may have preferential rents, and so they have the ability to raise rents. Modestly, I'm not suggesting that they're doing anything wrong or anything like that, but they have avenues of increasing income to cover costs other than than the minimal guideline increases.
But they don't have anything that any other owner would have available to them as well. If some nonprofit owner felt like the guidelines was a problem for any given year, they could also look for the tax forgiveness program through HPD. They could also apply for a loan program through HPD. There's any program that Barika mentioned was available to any other nonprofit owner in the city.
Am I wrong in thinking that if you are a not-for-profit, doing not-for-profit work in a building, you're exempt from New York City real estate tax?
You were wrong.
Okay, so what is the right answer?
Depends on the original deal as it was negotiated with HPD.
Right, so
Often factor that into the package, but not always.
I thought there was an exemption for not-for-profit, for tax-exempt organizations in the New York City.
It depends on what activity the nonprofit organization is doing.
Yeah, if it's doing not-for-profit activity, I thought there was an exemption.
Renting housing.
So
Real
renting
estate is not a
But
nonprofit activity.
low-income, providing low-income housing is not a tax-exempt purpose?
right. So I'm a nonprofit that we own a floor in Manhattan. We don't pay real estate taxes for our floor because we use it for our offices. So if a nonprofit using it for their office space, right, that's exempt purposes and won't pay real estate taxes. But if you're renting it to tenants, unless you're under some other program, like a regulatory agreement with the city and some loan forgiveness program connected to it, you aren't exempt from real estate taxes.
Okay.
Yeah, to the extent nonprofits are not paying real estate taxes, it's pursuant to some kind of law or contractual arrangement with the government agency.
Okay, thank you.
That's my understanding, anyway. Okay, anything else before we break for lunch? All right, thank you.